Okay, welcome to the latest edition of Data in the Hallway. Glad to be here with Mike Jang, who I've known for several years. I mean, Mike, you and I crossed paths at GitLab, but I think we first met at when they used to have OSCON in Portland,
Mhm.
which is a long open source institution that's unfortunately not around anymore. I saw you at like a panel discussion on documentation, so you've been very active in technical writing and documentation. And I think I told you, Mike, like we're organizing an event in a few months to encourage our community members to contribute to our documentation and help improve our documentation. So I thought this would be a good piece to have for people to get inspiration from. So it's good to have you, Mike.
I appreciate it.
Cool. So, I mean, this might seem like an obvious question, but uh, I think it's an important one. So, as a technical writer, or I've been at companies where we didn't even have technical writers. It was sort of engineering, other marketing people helping out and writing docs. But who are some of the audiences of documentation when you start working on, let's say there's a new feature coming out, you're writing documentation. Who are you thinking of when in terms of audience to for this documentation and who's going to be consuming the content?
In the industry we're in, we're talking
Yeah.
about software and mostly business to business software. Typically,
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about documentation and
Mm-hmm.
audience, what we call persona, the typical reader is either a developer or a sysadmin, a DevOps
Mm-hmm.
type person, typically.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but we need to set aside the typical end user software. Tip Today they deal mostly with apps on mobile devices, and people don't produce documentation for those. Well, actually they do, but few people read those. So
Mm-hmm.
documentation today in software is focused on those two groups.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point. I mean, this is something that I think, mentioned in the past. Like, maybe this was okay in the early days of IT. Like, people were writing with the very technical people in mind, people that are actually writing code, or like maybe even DevOps people that are really knee deep into working with systems and applications. But we often neglect like people that are actually using the software. It could be somebody at home,
Mhm.
or even like a 15-year-old that's trying to use an app, and that's sort of the audience that gets neglected. And I think that's why. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this all before. Like, a technical writing gets a bad rap sometimes. Like, you just write this very uninteresting, like boring technical stuff, and then that's not what documentation is all about. I mean, maybe like 30 years ago that was the case, but
Well, I mean,
yeah.
with a good technical writer, you can be
Mhm.
excited about what you're doing. You
Right.
typically you're writing for a company
Mm-hmm.
which is creating a new feature in a new product,
Mm-hmm.
and a tech writer has tested the new feature. They're excited about what it can do, and
Mm-hmm.
done properly, they can express that excitement through their writing.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Right.
and you mentioned the different sorts of personas beyond developers and sysadmins, but
Right.
to uh, to keep technical writing concise, you've got to focus on a certain persona. You don't want to have to explain things like a domain name or an IP address in all your documentation.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Once you have that baseline, then you can uh, have a common language for your audience that people can consume in a relatively easy way. I could go on and on. Please interrupt me
Mm-hmm.
if you want to redirect things. But uh, in in essence, you want documentation that's readable.
Right.
Yes,
Right.
the U.S. Navy created a standard called Flesh Kincaid back in the 70s for
Mm-hmm.
people, for their service people in submarines, who
Mm-hmm.
today they don't have internet access. So
Right.
if they need to look something up, the documentation is all they got.
right,
Uh, the standard that they set up is to make things readable for people at a U.S. ninth grade level, starting U.S.
oh,
high
okay,
school.
right,
How do you direct things to a specific audience and make things readable? In the
right,
words of Steve Krug, a UI master, uh, how do you create documentation that doesn't make me think, that's consumable by our audience without having to think about the words?
right, right. Yeah, I mean, I think, we talked about, even especially open source projects, contributors like contributing to docs or making it easy. I mean, I think that's why it's important. Like, although, I mean, I've met a lot of good technical writers like yourself, but, you're not, sometimes it's good to be in like an end user's shoes as they're consuming it. They have ideas in terms of, either the sentence isn't clear. I think this might be missing a step, because we all miss stuff. Like as developers or writers,
Mhm.
we miss things, and then I think that's why it's important to make it easy for, like, even if it's just making a suggestion or asking a question on the docs, right? Like you have a button where, hey, this sentence could be improved, or I think you forgot to explain X Y Z on these use cases. So I think making it open, even if your code isn't open source, having a docs like readily accessible, I think is pretty important. So
Absolutely. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
that's one of the strengths of open source.
mm,
You have your documentation and your repositories that are open to
right,
potential contributors.
right,
Not only do they help you with elements like spelling, but also with basic sorts of steps. Uh,
right,
they want to test software. They'll see a
hmm,
quick start guide and go through step 1, 2, 3 and think, wait a second, how do I do step 4?
right,
And then you can have a good discussion, not only for those contributors, but it's important for the company to be able to tell potential customers, just follow
right,
these steps and you'll
right,
be able to test our software. If they can't do it, they'll go to a competitor.
right, right, exactly. So yeah, I mean, it's critical for like a usability, and I think this may have been during the panel discussions I was referring to years ago. I think you and other panelists talked about, it's not just like a documentation isn't just product documentation. It's not just something that's docs.whatever.com. Like there are other like a written materials or content that people consume. And I think I was very impressed with the fact that everybody on the panel took a very wide view in terms of like looking at blogs, even looking at like the comments in the code, if your code is in open repository. So I thought that was actually pretty impressive in terms of taking a holistic view of how different people like to consume or acquire knowledge or consume things. So,
Yep. I mean, there's a
yeah.
whole hierarchy of documentation starting with
Hmm.
comments and code. You
Yeah.
want those so it's understandable by the next person who changes or modifies that code.
Hmm.
Uh, but that leads to developers who say, "Hey, it's all there in the code comments. Just read
Hmm.
the code." But when you have
Right.
people evaluating a product, they look
Right.
at that and think, "I don't have time for this," which is
Right.
why you end up with READMEs, blog posts, and eventually product documentation.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean that I'm kind of chuckling because this is when I was at the Linux Foundation working with a lot of open
Right.
source developers, and then this one developer, I mean, he's a very smart guy and a nice guy, just doesn't like documentation, just doesn't motivate him, and which is fine. That happens.
Mhm.
And then he made this like a open comment about just read the code, like and I turned to him and said, look, you can read code, like I can't read your code, like I have no idea what's going on. So we had an interesting discussion over beer, and then I mean he was always good. Like by release time, documentation is all in place. He'll work with his team members, but that was just something that he just doesn't want to do. I mean that happens, right? I mean not
Mhm.
it's not everyone's cup of tea. And then he made this rippling comment about, hey, just read the code. I'm going, well, first of all, like how are average people going to find code? Like,
Mhm.
and then not everybody knows. Like, I think he was writing in like Python. Like, not everybody knows Python. They could,
Mhm.
like I don't even know what this variable means. Like, so we had an interesting conversation over beer, but I've heard those comments before from developers. So, uh, so I think you mentioned like some of them already. Like, let's say you're evaluating a product or you're forming a new team to write a new documentation. Like, what are some of the key ingredients of what makes a good documentation? What are some of the important ones um, that that's sort of your guiding principle for good docs?
You want what you present in documentation should be just the information that your target reader needs. They don't
Mm-hmm.
want the extra stuff. And vectoring off the previous discussion, there are developers out there who are enthusiastic about documentation and want to
Hmm.
tell people everything down to the last
Right.
parameter. But
Yeah.
if you present everything that a product can do to people on documentation, they're going to get lost and say, I don't have time to go through all this.
Hmm. Right. It's just having like too much information, I guess becomes a barrier after a while. So
Absolutely.
yeah, cool, cool. So I mean, that kind of reminds me of, I think it's a good writing principle in general. Like this is years ago, I took a writing class, and one of the exercises we did was to reduce the number of words or characters. You would write something, this is an exercise in class, and then the professor would say, just cut it down and
Mhm.
then get it down to the essence. And uh, I mean, I didn't like appreciate the point of that exercise until much later, because if it's too verbose and you have too many adjectives and stuff, like you kind of lose people. I think that's probably the same principle you have on technical documentation. So
Absolutely. I mean, there's
yeah.
so much documentation out there that looks like a wall of text.
Mm-hmm.
Take your typical specification in RFC or whatever. It's just text, not broken down, typically
Mm-hmm.
not bulleted. If you look at readability heat maps, people will read the first paragraph and they might check out a few things in following paragraphs. You've
Mm-hmm.
got to be able to structure your documentation in ways people will that catch people's attention for critical points. Uh, for me, it's sort of a converging of principles of UI text and documentation. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's all coming together. Good writing becomes part of a UI. How do you make it work for people?
Right. Cool. Yeah. Uh, sounds sounds great. Yeah, hopefully I'll be interested to see like when we have our event in a few months, like what kind of feedback we get from people. Like, we'll see what kind of pull requests come in, what kind of issues get open. And I mean we'll have some issues where we'll ask people to, can you debug this documentation? It's a new feature. Can you actually walk through the product and can you actually do this? Like, does it, like you're saying, like, is this step four, does it even make sense, or is it even necessary, right? So I'm really looking forward to what kind of feedback we get. More so than the contributions, I think. I mean, contributions great from the community, but hopefully it'll give me and also our my colleagues in the docs team like some things to think about based on the feedback.
I love what
Mm,
I'm hearing about your
mm,
approach. I mean, there are
mm,
so many open source doc sprints where
mm.
all people end up doing is saying, "Oh, that word is spelled wrong. I've made a
Yeah,
contribution,"
right,
and
right.
that's hardly valuable to the software company. But if you
Mm,
focus your contributors on, oh, test our stuff, see if it
mm,
works based on the documentation, that
mm,
that becomes really helpful in both directions, not only for the
mm.
company, but
Right,
helping the contributor qualify as a valuable writer, somebody who can help the
right.
company actually present their software in a way that helps their customers.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, we just talked about, your sort of guiding principle in terms of good documentation. I'll sort of flip this around. What are some of the common mistakes that you see, like whether it's open source communities or companies making with documentation? Like, what are some common pitfalls that you've seen? I mean, one, sorry to steal your thunder. One I've seen from a lot of open source projects is they put off documentation until the end. You know, like a few days before like a release date, and the year time crunch, and then you can imagine the quality of the documentation that comes out because you're like sort of writing under the gun. I mean, that's sort of one of my one of the things that I've seen, but I'm sure you have others that you want to share. But
Well, I mean, in an ideal world, you have something called documentation-driven development, where
mhm,
developers work from documentation and say, "Okay, we know that we want this kind of functionality. It's already written down. Here's
mhm.
what we're going to do," and then a writer can follow along with development, follow along with the pull requests, build the build the product with the new feature, and then say, "Oh yeah, it's going to be steps one through six,"
Mhm.
and I can add that and follow along and create documentation as people do their development.
Cool, cool. Yeah, so it's very like underappreciated part of the product because I mean I sort of emphasize that like when I talk to different open source communities, product isn't just software and UI. It's like documentation is a key component of it because I mean, I haven't written like a very useful code in a long time, but one of the ways I evaluate companies, whether I'm looking for a job or as a potential vendor or evaluating a project, I read their docs. And then I'll look at different elements like is it a good onboarding tool? Does it make sense? Does it have good bones in terms of like logical structure? Like you know, like you have like things like configuration at the beginning and including like rationales of the software. Like if that's in place, I have a much better like impression of the product or a project than I would do otherwise. Like if I need to find something and it takes a lot of effort, then I think it puts me off. Like I think you were saying earlier, that's what causes people to kind of jump ship. Like I'm going to look
Mhm.
at because I mean it's very rare, especially this day and age. Like you're the only player in that space. Like
Mhm.
whether it is database, DevOps, or whatever it is, there are plenty of other competitors out there. And if maybe I'm kind of unique in terms of like looking at their documentation first, but you know my gut feeling is if their onboarding tool is poor, then I'm going to have a very difficult like I'm going to have very difficult experience like working with their software or even the company. So
Well,
yeah.
I'm not a developer
Yeah.
myself, and as you said, you don't I haven't done development work in a while, but
Mhm.
we still approach documentation and read it from a similar point of view. Giving a
Mhm.
shout out to Adam Devander and his book, quote unquote, "Developer Marketing Does Not Exist." Of course, it exists, and it exists in product documentation. Can you read it? Does it look credible? Can you use the steps to actually do something? Uh,
Mhm.
Going back a little bit, writers, similar to QA, they're the first users who test new features in a product. Uh,
Mhm.
they're the first users. They're the first essentially beta, I guess, alpha testers for a company to say,
Mhm.
"Okay, this actually works." No, no, it doesn't. Done done
Yeah.
properly, they are integrated as part of the development process.
Mhm. Cool. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I definitely appreciated, you know, being involved in a couple of open source projects, the importance of docs. I mean, it's a good landing spot, and it takes a tremendous amount of effort. So having good technical writers like even in the early days, I think it's pretty important because I think this is one of the things. If you don't get it right early on in your project or a product, it becomes very difficult to recover. I think like you need to unwind things that weren't done correctly, and so it's no difficult than writing code, I guess, in that regard. So
Mhm.
cool.
I mean,
Yeah.
when I'm deeply into a project, I feel
Mhm.
when I feel good, it's because I've been able to file bugs to say, "Hey, this isn't working as
Mhm.
intended." Uh, one QA has done the same thing. I've sat in an office with a QA, and the person essentially became my best work friend because we were finding the same sorts of problems and
Yeah, okay.
talking things out.
Cool, cool. Awesome. Yeah. So one of my fond memories that I have with you when we were both at GitLab is attending the Write the Docs event. Like I know you're still very active with the Write the Docs community. And I was just floored. I mean, we wanted to encourage the Write the Docs community to help improve our docs at GitLab. And I was just floored with the amount of interest that we got. I mean, this is like in the dark ages where it was COVID, so we couldn't be there in person in Portland, or I mean, I think you Write the Docs at events, like two events in different parts of the world. Unfortunately, it was virtual, but the amount of interest that I saw on Zoom panels was just amazing. People wanted to, hey, walk me through the mechanism of submitting a merge request to fix a simple typo. I mean, they were very excited and happy. And then a lot of them were very interested in getting involved in open source somehow. I assume that's still the case today, and I was just very impressed. But
Oh, absolutely.
yeah, yeah,
It's still the case because
hmm
people want to become part of software documentation. Writers want to learn the tools,
hmm
specifically Git. It's sort of fundamental to docs as code, where you actually build documentation using the same principles you use to build a product. The sessions that we together helped run at Write the Docs were part of that, and I'm
hmm
glad to say that I don't know if that gospel is the right word, but that philosophy has spread to other writing
hmm
organizations, groups like even the old Society for Technical Communication, Content plus
Wow,
UX.
right.
I mean, it's gone everywhere.
Cool, cool. So, I mean, which sort of leads me to the next question is doing documentation for open source project or product different than closed source products? I know you work at both open source and closed source companies. Is the approach like that different, or is it's like a core principle sort of stay the same? I don't know if you notice any difference between open source versus non-open source like software when you're writing docs.
Well, an analogy I like to make is with that is with security software, and I've pretty much done security software for most of my career for the past 10 years. You want
hmm
to keep certain things under wraps. Yes, you'll test things with what might be considered PII, personally
hmm
identifying information, but you never want to have that stuff in your documentation or even in your pull requests, because
Right.
if you're open source, that stuff
hmm
gets revealed. So
Right.
what do you do about that?
Right. Yeah. So I guess if you're open source, you need to have more caution about like, how you work and what you put in the docs. Because inadvertently you could expose something, whether it's IP or like a PII, like you said. So that's interesting. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
But on the
yeah.
other hand, the advantage
hmm
of open source is that especially when you're a lone writer, you need people to talk to
hmm
say, okay, I've got this problem. If your stuff is closed, then all you can do is talk in general terms, and people will say, "Huh, that's interesting," and they
hmm
won't be able to give you a solution. If you're able
Right.
to open source your documentation, you can present it and say, hey, look here. Here's the link to the file or system I'm having trouble with. Can you help me
Mm-hmm.
with that? Then you can harness the power of communities, not only write the docs, but the communities behind a lot of these quote unquote static site generators that are used to
hmm
create docs as code systems. What I
Right.
created a first time documentation with something called Hugo, also known as a static site generator. I relied on the Hugo and something called the Doxy community. They were great help with helping me understand, hey, this is what I can do to actually build documentation in production.
Cool. Awesome. So. So this has become, I have a couple of more questions left. I appreciate your time. This has become a pretty, I heard this on NPR yesterday about like AI and writing like documentation or writing like paper at a university. Like when ChatGPT and other AI tools became available, concerns about like, how do we tell if a person wrote this documentation or an AI? So has AI changed the way you work in documentation, or do you have you started using like a chat GPT and other tools to help with your job, or I don't know if it's still sort of the early days and hasn't had a as big of an impact as like people are making it out to be. But
I mean, yes, it's still the early days, but
mhm,
the big problem people are discovering with AI is the
mhm,
old Jigo problem: garbage in, garbage out.
mhm, right.
That's what the root of what people in AI are euphemistically calling hallucinations. Uh,
Oh, okay.
it's essentially it's mansplaining as a service,
Right.
where your AI responds to you with confidence that that an incorrect answer is the right way to go. How do you get
Mhm,
around it? Uh, well, I'm finding there are a number of companies out there that are looking at documentation as a quote unquote clean source. Uh,
mhm,
can you train your AI models with your documentation as content to give you
mhm.
better answers?
Oh, okay. Cool. So yeah, I guess still early days. I've sort of experimented here and there, like especially for like a CFPs for a conference. I would
Mhm.
like a feed bullet points, or I would write a first draft and like ask ChatGPT to improve this text under like 1,000 words or something. And it's been a pretty mixed bag, I think. Like I mean, some are just like horrendous. It was a lot worse than, in my opinion, what I wrote. And but there are a couple of times where I was like, wow, this is actually not bad. So I guess it's just a matter of knowing how to use it and what information you feed in. Like you said, garbage in, garbage out. Like it's not gonna if you're feeding a bunch of nonsense, it's not gonna come up with anything useful. I would think so.
But if you feed it
Yeah,
good stuff like
yeah.
good good CFP proposals that you see, and say, based on
Mhm.
these excellent CFPs, can you revise my CFP to something that would appeal to people who judge them and
Mhm.
make the decision on whether to pick my proposal?
Cool. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's still like I haven't figured it out. So like I still got to be a lot more intelligent about how I use like AI tools. So final question. I mean, this is a tradition that we started. We hope to keep going. Is we get guests from all over the world. Mike. You're in one of my favorite cities in Portland, Oregon, like a land of great beer and salmon, like as I call it. So not to be confused with Portland in the East Coast in Maine, but tell people about Portland, Oregon that people may not be familiar with, or like what you like about your city. So,
Well, a lot of people think of Portland and they think of the game called the Oregon Trail, but
mhm,
that's based on people who went across the Oregon Trail from the East Coast. A lot of them came from New England.
mhm,
So when they had decided, oh yeah, we're going to have to name our city. What do we name it?
mhm.
It was based on a contest between somebody from Portland, Maine, and Boston,
Oh, okay.
Massachusetts. They flipped
Oh,
a
okay.
coin. It was two out of three. I forget whether it was heads or
Yeah.
tails, but
Right.
it became Portland and not Boston.
Wow. So it was decided on a coin flip. Like,
Yep,
and if it had gone the other way, it could have been called Boston, Oregon. That's
yep.
that's pretty cool. So yeah, did not know that. So yeah, I mean, like I said, it's a great city. Unfortunately haven't been since the pandemic, but hopefully I could make it up there and we can share a good pint. So
Absolutely. I look forward
cool.
to that.
Yeah, well, thanks for your time, and yeah, I think hopefully this gave people a lot of food for thought as we sort of gear up for our Docs event. Look forward to seeing you again, and thanks for all the listeners for listening. Take care.
Thanks so much.